joining me on a quilting tale today. My name is Shaylin, and today I want to talk about labels. Labels are sometimes an afterthought after a quilt is finished rather than being a part of finishing the quilt. I know I have a few that don't have labels I need to go back and add, and so I want to show you 3 different ways that you can include a label on your quilt and talk a little bit about why we put labels on them. So, as uncomfortable as it might be to think about, our quilts are eventually going to go beyond the recipient or our own homes, and they might go to someone who doesn't know who made the quilt. And so we want to put some of that quilt's history on it so that it can be remembered and more meaningful to whoever may have it in the future, as well as today. So I'm going to show you a way of making a label yourself using a piece of square fabric, and then I'll also show you some ways to attach pre-made labels. So let's get into the first one, and this is a great way to use up some of your selvage scraps that you might be holding on to. I'll show you what I mean by that. So when I see a piece of selvage that I like the saying on, or maybe there's a little shape or design on it that I really like, I just cut it off and throw it in here. I'll show you some examples of what I mean. So I like to leave a piece of the fabric on there too, just to keep the print and colors in there. But like this one says, the best journey always takes you home. This one says the same thing, so these were from the at-home collection. Here's a Christmas one. It's the most wonderful time of the year. So you can see I just leave a little bit of the print on it as well. Some of these I just liked because of the colors, or the like this one, I like the little seahorses on. So if there's a little shape or something like a teacup, I hold on to those and, try and preserve as much length as possible, because sometimes you'll want a longer one. This one says stiletto because sometimes it's just fun to be fancy. Or this one says, adopt the pace of nature, her secret is patience, by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So I just hold on to a bunch of these, and if I like the saying and it seems to go along with the recipient, maybe how they live their life, or just a piece of advice for them or something, you can attach one of these to the label that I'm going to show you how to make. So I like to pick one that just kind of coordinates with the prints that I used in the quilt, but let me show you how you can put some of these scraps to use. The first step in making your label is to cut a square, and I'm doing a 7-inch square. If you want to write a lot, you might consider doing an 8 or 9 inch, but I think 7 inches gives you enough to write the recipient and your name, maybe the date. You can get, depending on how large your handwriting is, a few lines on there. So you want to make sure it's pressed nice and flat, and then you are going to fold it diagonally in half. And just press that seam diagonally. Give it a little steam to really set it in there. Okay, and so now this is going to be a corner label. You'll want to think what corner of the quilt, top or bottom, left or right. It's going to go on the back side. The folded edge here is going to be what's visible. You're going to sew the open sides into your binding. So again, that's why you want to think about the orientation. Now at this point you could just write your message, and just be careful not to write to the edges because you're going to sew a 1/4 inch in, so just don't write to the edges. But again, the folded line will be visible, so it'll make kind of like a little pocket. I'm gonna do something just to fancy this up a little more, and so I have a bunch of selvage edges that I've just saved. I liked this saying here. It says, be grateful, be kind, smile often, live the good life. And so I think that's just good advice to send my cousin off with. So what I'm going to do is kind of center it on here as best I can. When I have it sewn on, I'm gonna trim it just to keep this corner going. So I will trim a little bit off. And I want a little bit of this gray print to show too. So I'm going to fold it over. And I don't have enough on the left side here to center it perfectly, but that's okay. But I want a little bit of the gray edge to show. And I'm going to stitch it in the white space here. So I'm going to do 2 lines of stitching on here. One just kind of where the fabric meets the selvage edge, and then just down below here right above the little frayed edges, just to hold it down securely in place. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and I think I'll stick a few pins in it just to keep it where I want it. You can see the back folds over just a little bit here. Alright, so first I'm going to stitch a line just again right below where the fabric and the white selvage edge meet. And I'm using white thread, so it's going to blend in really well. Now I'm just going to flip it and sew just above the frayed edge here, so you can see it's kind of fuzzy there. So I'm going to sew just above that to secure it down onto the label. Okay, now I'm going to trim, just following the edges of the label. So you can maybe line up the edges to a line on your ruler, or on your mat, I mean. Just like that. Trim that off. And then flip it. Go. One thing I realized I forgot to do before I sewed my first line here was I want to make sure that this raw edge is taken care of here at the top of my strip. It's not going to show because, like I said, it's going to be the label, so it will be like a little pocket where, you know, you might feel it, but I was just thinking as it's getting washed and things, I don't want it to get all frayed. Another thing you might do is zigzag stitch it right on the edge, but what I'm going to do is fold it over just a little bit and just press a crease in there. So I'm just folding it over maybe a 1/4 inch, maybe even a little less, depending on how much fabric you have. You just want to make sure when you fold it back over your label edge that there's enough to catch the trim when you're sewing that original line. So, a little warm. So I'm going to pin it one more time and then go ahead and sew again just right under where the fabric meets the white selvage edge. Alright, so my label's ready for the message, and if you're really confident with writing in your permanent marker, you might just go for it. Just make sure that you don't go right up to the edge because you want to account for your seam allowance. You might also lightly write it in with pencil or the erasable marker and then go over it with your marker. I'm just going to use a plain old fine tip Sharpie. I'm sure there are fabric markers that are permanent you can use too, but I've just always used a Sharpie and it seems to wear well with washing. ready to be attached now to the binding. You'll notice there's a little bit of the blue pen peeking out. I wanted to make sure I could get everything in my message on there and centered, and that blue pen allows me to erase with a little bit of water if need be. But when I wash the quilt, the blue will go away, leaving just the Sharpie. Now, something to consider with your labels is using a label as a quilt record. And so with my label, my cousin knows who I am, but if this quilt gets passed on to anyone or given to someone else, or just any reason someone else would have it who doesn't know who I am, I don't have a last name on there. And so that's something to think about. You might want to put where the quilt was made, or the occasion for the quilt on the label. I'm going to be putting a care label that has some washing instructions, and then it also says that it's handmade by me with my last name. And so I'll show you how I attach this little label as well. But for that reason, I opted to keep my last name off. So I'm going to go ahead and attach this now to the quilt in the corner. Have your quilt oriented the way you want, and then you're just going to line up the raw edges to the raw edges of the quilt. I'm going to just pin these in so that way when I go around with the binding, I know that it will all catch in the stitching when I do my 1/4 inch stitch. Alright, so I've got it pinned, and I wanted to make sure, especially at the little corners here, that I really pin those down to make sure that they don't flip or anything when I'm sewing. But before I do the binding, I'm actually going to put the care tag on now. So I folded the quilt in half lengthwise to find the center point, and I marked it with a pin. And so I'm going to be sewing the care label on. Again, I know that I'm going to lose a little bit of this for the binding, so I'm going to sew it on about, I don't know, maybe a 1/2 inch or so above where I think the binding will end there. So let me get my thread ready and set this camera down, and I'll show you how I do that. I got these labels from an Etsy shop, and they're sew on. You could also get iron on, but they're on, the paper it's on is kind of sticky, but the actual label isn't. It's a cotton label that's machine washable. And so I'm going to just kind of position it where I want it to be. I might just stick the pin in here to keep it in place while I get started. And so I have a needle and thread, and I'm just using white thread since the label is white. And I'm going to just make a little knot at the end of it. Oh, I'm just going to wrap it around a bunch of times, cross under my thread, wrap it a couple more times, and then scoot that bundle of thread down over the eye, and then pull it. And I've got a little knot there. So I'm going to cut a bit of the tail off. And now when you're sewing on a quilted top, you have to be careful not to go through all 3 layers. I just want to go through the backing and batting. And so I actually took out the basting stitches, and so there's a little bit of room. I can get my finger under here in between the top and the batting, and that's part of why I'm putting this closer toward the bottom, is just so I have that room to work there. So I'm going to start by going under the batting, just making sure I'm not going through the whole thing, and I'm going to come up through the label, and I'm just going to do a straight stitch on this. I just want to stitch it close to the edge, just to keep it from coming off here. So I'm going to just do little stitches, And when I come out, I just want to make sure I'm not going through the top. Okay. And I'm going to come up again just a little bit over where my the thread last came out, trying to keep them aligned. Not going diagonally or crooked. I'm just gonna keep going around, and you can have a little gap in between, but try and keep your stitches the same length. And again, just feel to make sure it's not going through the top. I'm coming up on my last stitch here, so I'm going to send it back in. And then on the inside here, I'm just going to loop it in the batting, making sure that you can't see the needle on the backing. So I just went up and down, just through the batting. A few times, so it's just kind of buried in there. So if it comes loose, it would have to come loose through all of it in the wash, but I'll just trim the end off there so it's knotted and the thread's buried. And so now I'm ready to put on the binding. For my third and final label, I'm going to be attaching it to the bottom corner of the Ancestry photo quilt that I made earlier. And I had already put the binding on it, so I just undid the binding on the back where I'm going to put the label, and I ironed the binding flat again. So I'll show you now how I'm going to attach this label. This label has been printed on fabric by the same company that printed the photos for this quilt on fabric. And so since it's going in this corner here, I'm going to stitch it just like I would with the binding, reattach the binding because I took it off, and stitch it on the whole quilt. And I'm going to, just to get a clean edge on the top and the right hand side, I'm gonna press just a little bit, about a 1/4 inch or so in, and I'll be doing a stitch around those two sides. The other sides are just going to be sewn in with the binding. So let me give those a quick press here. Alright, so that's been pressed about a 1/4 inch or maybe a little more in. So I'm going to go ahead and take this to the sewing machine now and sew the two raw edges into the quilt. Alright, so I've got one side clipped in, and you can see I have the binding clipped on as well, so it's going to become a part of this whole quilt sandwich here. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this side, and then I'll make my mitered corner and do the same thing to attach it to the bottom. Alright, so I have my label stitched into the corner now with the binding also attached. And so we're going to just do a blind stitch around the two folded edges, and we just want to make sure that the needle doesn't go all the way through to the top. So we'll just go nice and slow. We'll start by taking a threaded needle and just making a knot at the bottom. So I'm just going to loop this around a few times and then go under the thread and then pull this knot down. And I have a knot at the bottom now. All right, so we're gonna just start. You can start at either end, but I'm just going to go right under the label and just into the backing a little, and just try and make my needle come up right where the label is attached. And I'm using a thread color that matches the label. And so now we're just gonna blind stitch. So I'm going to just take my needle just like you would do with the binding, and I'll have a video to show the binding, but I'm just gonna tuck the needle into the fold. Just a small little bite there, and pull it through. And then where it came out, I'm going to go into the backing and do the same thing so it comes out of the backing. I'm just being careful not to go all the way through to the front of the quilt. And pull. And then I'm going to, where it came out of the backing, I'm going to start in the fold of the label again, and this hides the stitch. And just come out again, out of the fold. I'm just going to keep repeating that, going into the batting now, where my last stitch ended. So I'll just do that all the way around. Let's see if I can get this at a better angle here. So I just came out of the label. So where it comes out of the label here, I'm going to now just go into the backing, start at the same spot, and just a little bite out of the backing. Again, making sure I don't go all the way through. You don't have to pull it real tight or you might get puckers. So again, I'm just going to try and get my stitch to go about 1/4 of an inch or so, maybe a little less, through the fold. And then again through the backing. Try and keep the little stitches the same size. This is just a slow, patient process, but it'll look really nice. Alright, so the label is attached and you can't see the threads thanks to the whip stitch. So all I did at the end was just tie it off in a knot here, and I just did a double knot. So I'm just gonna snip that thread and finish hand stitching the binding as I usually do. And again, I will have an upcoming tutorial to show how I do my binding, but those are the 3 labels. I hope seeing those 3 label options gave you some inspiration on how you might incorporate a label into your quilt and hopefully make it just another part of finishing your quilt rather than an afterthought that sometimes we forget. When you're trying to decide what to put on a label, just think, if you came across a quilt, what would you want to know about it? Maybe who made it, who it was quilted by perhaps, what was the occasion, the year, anything that you'd wonder about it would be fair game to put on a label. So make sure that your hard work and all the love and care that you put into making that top gets remembered for years to come, and put that label on there. Remember to like and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more tips like this. Thank you for watching.